For those who don't know me, I'm Rebecca Katz. I direct the Center for Global Science and Security here at Georgetown. And we have been running a seminar series. We try to do 3 to 4 seminars in a given semester. And this is our first of the fall 2019 semester. And we are delighted to have Ron Klain with us here today. I will read his long, embarrassing bio in a second. But the way that these are meant to be informal, as you see, we usually have a mix of students and professionals from the community. And if it is okay with you, I'd love even before you start to do a around the table and everyone can say who they are. But before we do that, let me read the embarrassing bio.
Hillary Clinton is coming.
Hillary Clinton's coming. Yeah. Let me lead with the most important piece here, which is that Ron is a graduate of Georgetown University, and also an adjunct professor in the government department. Yeah. And we also from Harvard Law, but we'll take the Georgetown piece first.
100%.
And most relevant to this discussion today is your time as the Ebola czar under the Obama administration, coordinating the 2014-16 West Africa Ebola response. But you're currently, let me get this right, the Executive Vice President and General Counsel at Revolution, which maybe you can tell us what that is.
Okay.
I have a page of his legal background, which I'm going to skip because honestly I get lost in that. But it includes, clerking, Supreme Court, and some really non-impressive stuff, and then an extensive career in public service and in supporting Chief of Staff to Vice President Biden, Senior Aide to President Obama, Chief of Staff for Vice President Al Gore, Attorney General Jan Marino, Staff Director for Senate Democratic Leadership Committee, so really not a lot to do with politics. And then another long paragraph here of all the boards and nonprofits that he contributes to. But I'm going to skip that, we'll just post his bio, and then let you just talk.
I'm just going to talk for 15, 20 minutes and then happy to turn it into a discussion. We just finished Climate Week and thinking a lot about climate change in New York and here in Washington. And it was a week filled kind of with apocalyptic scenarios from the future. But if you think about apocalyptic scenarios, the one that really sticks with my mind is the idea that next week or next month or next year at some point in time in the future, a bunch of people could shuffle into the Oval Office and tell the president that there's some event going on in the world, 1 million people have died, governments are falling, regional violence and conflict, refugee crisis, mass migration, and worst of all, that a lot of that is headed towards the United States. Now, there's a lot of things that could cause that kind of apocalyptic scenario: a weather disaster exacerbated by climate change, terrorist action, biochemical attacks, something like that. But of all the things that could cause it, the single most likely thing to cause it in the next 15 to 20 years is a pandemic. And as we think about what are the real security threats to our world, to our country, we have to talk about the one that's most often overlooked, I think, in the conversation, which is pandemic illness. That's why Bill Gates has said that it's a pandemic more than anything else that's likely to kill 10 million people or more in the next 30 years, and why he said there's a 50-50 chance something like that will happen in the next 30 years. So we also know that this isn't science fiction or mere speculation, right? We just finished marking the 100th anniversary of the Spanish flu epidemic, perhaps the least understood, least studied, least remembered event in American history, the largest mass casualty event in American history. More Americans died from the Spanish flu than died from World War I and World War II combined. In our own time, we've seen HIV/AIDS epidemic in this country and around the world, and the loss of millions of lives due to that. And then most recently, most perhaps visibly to us in the kind of the near term, was the Ebola epidemic in West Africa in 2014, 2015, which took about 20,000 lives. Now we're seeing some version of that again play out in Congo. I want to talk about that in a few minutes. But I think before we talk about what's going on there and what it means and why it's different, it's worth trying to rack up some of the lessons from the 2014, 2015 Ebola epidemic in West Africa and kind of figure out, I mean, people will be studying this for a long time, but figure out what we should learn from it, what the takeaways are. And to me, there are three super high-level takeaways. The first is that it didn't have to be as bad as it was. The outbreak of Ebola was actually detected relatively early. Responders were on the scene relatively early. But then the response wasn't pursued. People thought it was arrested. The idea that just kind of getting it almost all the way stamped out was good enough, that the world could kind of ignore events that were far away, turned out to be wrong. And as a result of that mistake, human error, conscious decision to kind of take the foot off the accelerator, not do what we needed to do when it was preventable, the thing exploded into the disaster that it was in 2014, 2015. Now, if point one is it could have been worse than it was, point two is it could have been a lot worse. If the point was it could have been better than it was, point two is it could have been a lot worse. In the fall of 2014, the CDC forecast that 1 million people might die in West Africa from Ebola. That didn't even include the possibility that it would spread to countries where it wasn't yet then raging. In the end, as I said, the death toll was around 20,000, which is horrible and ghastly, but obviously a lot better than 1 million people. And why was that? Well, I think the bulk of the credit for turning it around goes to the people of West Africa themselves. They made the decisions, took the courageous steps of changing their behaviors, changing their social patterns, changing the way they interacted. They put themselves on the front lines. Almost 1,000 healthcare workers died fighting the epidemic. And all the more West Africans, 1,000 healthcare workers died fighting the epidemic there. So there's no question that this was a locally led, locally driven, locally transformed response. But that local effort was substantially powered by help from the United States. And I think it's something our country should be very proud of what we did, what our contribution was. We sent over 10,000 civilian government workers to West Africa, 3,000 troops in the first ever deployment of the U.S. military to fight an epidemic in Operation United Assistance, and thousands more Americans went as volunteers, healthcare workers, and all kinds of other capacities. I think President Obama deserves a great deal of credit for mustering that whole of government response that was really a game changer in West Africa. Thanks to our intervention and help, we've vastly ramped up the testing capabilities, the treatment capabilities, the response, the infrastructure that was needed. And above all, the president set an example. He demanded that science, not fear, set our policies here in the United States and around the world, and that, and then a bipartisan majority in Congress, appropriated $5 billion to fund our Ebola response efforts, both overseas and here at home. All in all, in a time of great cynicism about our government and our ability to get things done, the Ebola response reminds us that it is possible for Democrats and Republicans to work together. It is possible for our government to be effective. It is possible for us to make a huge difference. So that's the second lesson. The third is that we still have a long, long way to go to be ready for that epidemic or pandemic that's out there in the future. In many ways, as difficult as it was, and now let's get into a little bit of the contrast of what happened in 2014, 2015, and what's happening now. As difficult as that was, Ebola in West Africa was a relatively easy case for the global response system. First of all, Ebola is a very, very hard disease to transmit. Only transmits when people are very ill. When people are very ill, they're not moving around a lot. You know, it was really, the rate at which it spreads is nothing compared to what you'd see in something like a flu pandemic or something else that's airborne. It broke out in 3 countries that have very good relations with the major donor nations. So it was very easy for the US and the UK and France to muster substantial resources into Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. They are countries that were open to outside help. They were countries that, though they had been through very difficult times earlier, were relatively stable as these events unfolded, and where troops from the UK and the US and France were welcomed as needed support, not as an invading force. And all that made a big difference. And also, I should say, as a real warning of what's to come, they were also countries where 2 of the 3 of them spoke English, the third one spoke France, and so finding epidemiologists and responders and contact tracers who spoke English and French was relatively easy. You can imagine now what the scenario might be like in the great pandemic that is to come, right? A future epidemic could be transmitted by airborne means and spread very quickly and very easily. it could break out in a part of the world that's much more densely populated. The largest city in West Africa, Conakry in Guinea, had 900,000 residents. So imagine if something like this gets loose in Rio de Janeiro or Jakarta or Beijing or something, an entirely different scenario. Also, the countries of West Africa, though connected to the world, still send relatively few travelers out to other parts of the world. India, for example, sends more travelers to the United States in a day than Liberia sends in a year. So you can imagine how different this would be in another setting. And of course, there are many places in the world, and Congo is one of them, where U.S. assistance, Western assistance, far from being welcome, would be resented. Our troops, far from being welcomed as logistical support, would be under assault. So imagining an epidemic breaking out in a place like Pakistan or Afghanistan or rural parts of China, it's just an entirely different scenario, and that's what we need to be aware of. What's going on in the DRC right now is some mix, some halfway point between the nightmare scenario and the West African scenario. On the kind of the similarity side, what we have is the disease is largely spreading in areas that are more sparsely populated. In the middle of the epidemic, there is Goma with 1 million people, and there have been a few cases identified there, but by and large, we're not talking about Buenos Aires or Jakarta or someplace like that. And of course, the most significant difference between what's going on now and going on then is the presence of a vaccine. At the very end of the 2014-2015 outbreak, we did the first field trials of Ebola vaccine. We found it to be extremely effective. Fortunately, we were able to beat the epidemic without it. But in the years since, the vaccine's been manufactured and it's been used. And it's really been used twice, and it's really interesting to think about the differences. It was first used in an outbreak in a different part of Congo earlier in 2018. Basically, classical ring vaccination strategy was used. They found the contacts, they vaccinated all the people around it. They gave about, I think, 1,000 shots and extinguished the epidemic. Kind of a happy ending, if you will. And everyone kind of thought this was basically the pattern for the future, that you'd identify these outbreaks early, you'd identify the contacts, you'd vaccinate around those contacts, and we'd never have something like we saw in 2014 ever again. I think there was a lot of discussion that you just never see something like that again. With Ebola, we now had this vaccine. But what we've learned time and time again is that vaccines do not save lives, vaccinations do. And there's a big gap between having a vaccine and getting it to the right people at the right place at the right time. And that's what we're seeing in Congo right now. Amazingly, at a level of scale one could have never imagined, over 220,000 vaccinations have been administered in Congo. And this is not a small project. The vaccine has to have kind of cold chain control, it has to be kept at -60. It's just what the WHO and its partners, what MSF and Gavi, which is providing the vaccine, have done is stunning. And even so, Ebola is still spreading in Congo. There's some signs recently that it might be letting up a little bit, but I think those signs are still quite ambiguous. There's also problems with the reporting, there's problems with, and so why? So why? We have a vaccine, we have hundreds of thousands of people getting the shot, why isn't this abating? And that's really, I think, what we should be focused on. And the reasons are, for all the reasons why in epidemic response, science and medicine are critical, but not enough. Logistics and politics and geopolitics all play a huge role in what works and what doesn't work. In Congo, there's huge violence and disruption. There's civil strife. We've had obviously responders killed. We've had responders attacked. It's a highly dangerous area. We have some of the guerrilla groups telling people that the response is actually spreading the disease, all this kind of instability and unrest. And I think what's important to think about that is, while I think a lot of the coverage of what's going on in Congo presents the conditions there as some kind of rare and unique perfect storm, this is just the nightmare scenario. In fact, the conditions there are the new normal. Like, this is what we are going to see. And in some ways, as I said before, as hard as it was, and I don't want to take anything away from the effort and the success of what we did in 2014, 2015, that was actually the rare case, the unusual case of a disease in a place that was relatively stable, friendly to outside intervention, strong, reasonably decent governments that really put the effort on to get this done. What we're seeing in Congo is much more likely to be what the rest of this looks like going forward. Disease breaking out in areas that are unstable, where there is civic unrest, where there's huge doubt about the authorities, where there's a confusion between the response and suppression of dissenting groups, where you have these, and if you think what's really dangerous about what's going on in Congo, in addition to where the disease is now, potential spread to refugee camps in South Sudan, where there are literally hundreds of thousands of refugees who are sitting duck for an epidemic like this if the disease crosses that border and gets over there. So the danger factors, if you think about it, what's going on in Congo is already the second worst Ebola epidemic in history. Only the 2014-2015 one is worse, but that vastly understates what's going on, right? Because if we hadn't given 220,000 vaccinations, what's happening in Congo would have been far worse than what we saw in 2014, 2015. Death toll would be far higher, and the thing would be spreading like wildfire. Already still, with everything that's going on, about 40% of the new cases each week are coming out of the community. The instability and the violence there makes contact tracing and a lot of the traditional solutions impossible. Or not impossible, but ineffective. So there's also one other difference that we need to talk about. And look, I wear two hats in my life. I care passionately and deeply about these issues, but I'm also, as you can tell from my bio, I've been involved in partisan politics. I am a political partisan. I am a Democrat. Any of you follow me on Twitter, you will know that I have a pretty red-hot Twitter feed. And so that, my biases are there. That's who I am. I've always taken the view that epidemic response shouldn't be a political issue. And as I said at the outset, when we responded in 2014, 2015, it was a bipartisan effort. We got bipartisan support from Congress, and there's really no reason why politics should enter into it. But you cannot ignore, as a factual matter, the difference between the posture and position of the United States under President Obama and what it is now under President Trump. That shouldn't be a surprise. During the Ebola outbreak in 2014, 2015, citizen Donald Trump was one of the foremost critics of the Obama response. He tweeted when President Obama decided to medevac healthcare workers who got Ebola from West Africa to the U.S. for treatment. He tweeted that that was a mistake, it was a disaster, that those people should be left to die. They had made their choice to go over and fight the disease, and that they should be left to die there. He's shown a hostility to science and research. Every budget he's sent up there has tried to cut some of these critical global health functions and research functions. And in some ways, the most profound thing is the philosophy of extreme isolationism and xenophobia that he represents is a huge obstacle to fighting these epidemics. We kind of saw that really in 2016, even before he got elected, when the Obama administration was trying to deal with the Zika epidemic in South America and in our own hemisphere, in our own country, in Puerto Rico, and had trouble getting the Republican majorities in Congress to pass funding because basically there was just, every time I spoke about it, I got the same response back from people, which is, hey, Zika is not a public health problem, it's an immigration problem. Just keep the immigrants out and we won't have Zika. Why don't you just build a wall or toughen it up? I think it's important for us who care about global health security and public health to remind people that we have a duty and an obligation to lead in this space, that when the U.S. does not lead, the world does not follow. For better or worse, we remain kind of the indispensable nation in epidemic and pandemic response. And that from our own selfish point of view, there is no wall we can build that is high enough or thick enough to keep disease out from our country. And so if we're going to be safe here in the U.S., we have to go around the world and fight these diseases where they are. That is in the humanitarian interest of the planet. It is in our own self-interest as a country, and it's something that has to be done. So what should we do now? Just a few quick thoughts, and then I'll shut up. First, to fight something like this, you need the right structure at the White House. As Rebecca mentioned, I was the first Ebola response coordinator, Ebola czar. But when that was done, I recommended to President Obama, and he accepted the recommendation of creating a permanent epidemic and pandemic preparedness and response director inside the National Security Council. We have a special group in the National Security Council that deals with climate change. We have one that deals with terrorist threats. I recommended that we do the same thing for epidemic and pandemic response. The president did that, put someone in that job. The first year of the Trump administration, they kept someone in that job, a very qualified person. But then on the day that McMaster was replaced by Bolton fired the person, shut down the unit, transferred it to state. That was a mistake. I think you're seeing some of the consequences of that now in the DRC response. I hope the next president will reverse that. We need to step up our commitment to global health security. The U.S. needs to invest more money in fighting these diseases and in helping other nations to fight the diseases. President Obama launched the Global Health Security Agenda in 2011. I think it made a huge difference. He helped establish African CDC. I think that's a very positive thing, but we need to keep at that. We need to do more of it. I also think, it's really important for us to do better here at home because, again, part of this is about preparing for what will come here eventually. And to me, that means really ramping up a public health emergency fund, which we don't really have adequately funded. It means really working on our response efforts. And it means also being consistent in our funding and efforts in this area. Right after the Ebola response, Congress put a bunch of money into domestic preparedness, a bunch of money into creating 10 regional pandemic or specialized health centers that could treat these diseases. All kinds of investments were made. And then in the years since then, in the 5 years since then, we've seen those investments slough off. We've seen the consistency of it slough off. Every year there's a report on how fast these regional centers could stand up and deal with patients. The response time gets longer and longer each year as resources get drained and drained each year. And we need to constantly train and retrain our people. This is a very fluid and fast-moving country. You train 40 people at a hospital on what to do about it, and 2 or 3 years later, half those 40 people are gone, moved on to other things. So this isn't a one-and-done scenario. This needs to be an ongoing and consistent program. Last thing I think we need to do is we need to redefine our relationship with the World Health Organization. I absolutely commend what Dr. Tedros has done since taking over, and particularly what he's done in the Congo. There's a great deal more transparency in the WHO's response than there was in 2014 and 2015. There's been a great deal more action and aggressiveness. There's been a great deal more immediacy to what they've done. And again, I know there's been some fighting this week between MSF and WHO about how the vaccine's been administered, and I think some of those criticisms are valid, but again, to step back, the idea that you could administer 220,000 doses of this vaccine in the conditions in which it's being administered in Congo is an unbelievable achievement. If you had asked me a year ago, is that possible, I would have given you very, very long odds that it was not possible. So I think there's been great improvement there. But there's still a long way to go with reforming the WHO. There's still a long way to go with improving its efforts. And lastly, I think we need to think about the question of what is our global response force to this sort of thing. I used to say back in 2014 that people would ask me kind of like, when do the black helicopters show up if Ebola breaks out in the United States? And I used to always say the danger isn't that the black helicopters are coming, the danger is that they are not coming, that there really is no one to respond. If we think about this pandemic risk as a great potential existential crisis for the human race in large part, the idea that we are going to face that crisis with with the WHO, which is fundamentally a regulatory, not a response group, and a bunch of underfunded, albeit heroic and well-intended NGOs, and that's kind of it, is a scary position to be in. And I think the world needs to think about whether or not we need to create some kind of white helmet battalion or response group that can provide security. You can see what a difference something like that could make. An international group that's equipped with both security and response capabilities could make a huge difference in Congo right now, where you're just basically sending unarmed doctors and nurses into really dangerous situations to try to help people. And that's had very tragic consequences. So we need some kind of thing that can respond. So with that, I'll stop and take your questions.
I have a long list, but Well, this has been growing as you do. But before I jump in, let me push to other folks first.
Yeah.
So recently they just announced that they would be introducing the Janssen vaccine
Yeah.
into the DRC. There's been a lot of controversy around that vaccine. What are your thoughts on it? I know, like, obviously the vaccination efforts have already been tremendous, and introducing the new one, especially with the 2-dosage setup, could be problematic. Do you see that being a positive thing, or?
Well, I think sadly it's a necessary thing. So, I mean, it is amazing and beautiful how effective the Merck vaccine is, right? I mean, something that did not exist at all 5 years ago. It's one dosage only. It's like 97.5% effective. I mean, just for the scenario we're facing, it's an amazing thing. Merck produced 300,000 doses. No one ever thought we would use them all. I mean, as I said, the first time it was used, 1,000 doses put this thing out. If you do the math, like, oh, it's 300 outbreaks. We're good for like the next 50 years, you know. And now 220,000 have been used in a matter of months. And so the end of the supply of that vaccine is in sight. And so I think there's no choice but to introduce the J&J vaccine, which, as you say, much less attractive for this purpose. First of all, been tested much less extensively. Its effectiveness is much less known, and it's a 2-dose vaccine. And in the conditions in which the response is operating, getting these shots into people twice is, 5x harder than getting them into people once. And so there's a lot of reasons why there was resistance to it. Understandable reasons why there's resistance to it. But I don't think that there's really any choice but to use it, given the fact that there's no sign that this epidemic is really coming under control, or at least the signs are quite ambiguous that it's coming under control. And I think, everyone in this room knows this, the danger here is, to use the cliche and trite forest fire metaphor, the danger here is that just one case, just one person, as long as the disease is still raging, shows up in the wrong place, and we are off to the races. Goma is a city of 1 million people with an international airport. There have been a few individual cases there, but if you've got 10 or 20 cases going in Goma, who knows what's going to happen, right? As I said, South Sudan is not that far away. I think the epidemic's been within 50 miles of the refugee camps there. It's not, forget someone on a scooter or a moped or whatever. Someone could walk to the refugee camps. And given the conditions there, we'd have Ebola in thousands of people before we even knew that it existed in these camps. And so I think you just have to do everything we can to try to get from, where we are now, which is 30, 40 cases a week, down to 0. And I think the J&J vaccine is, for better or worse, part of that, or maybe the only other tool we have. But it does also illustrate another problem that I left out of my remarks because I didn't want to talk for 5 hours, which is we don't really have a global system to rapidly approve or reject these emerging vaccines for emerging diseases or for emerging threats or for even non-emerging threats that occur in new conditions like what we're seeing in Congo. And I worked in the White House in 2009 during the H1N1 epidemic. I wasn't working on the response at all. I had a different job, but I saw it up close and personal. And what I can tell you is 2 things about that. Thing one is everyone there worked really hard, and it was a bunch of really smart people, and they did everything they could to fight that, and we completely effed it up. That's the second thing, And so by the time the vaccine was finally ready, the epidemic was over, and 60 million people in the United States got H1N1 that year. But for the fortuity that strain of flu turned out not to be nearly as virulent as people worried, that would have been like the greatest mass casualty event in American history. We'd have like a giant monument on the Mall to the millions of people who died in 2009 from H1N1, okay? And so, our inability to produce vaccine on time and produce vaccine in a way that it could be reliable is a critical risk exposure. But there are other policy issues around that. So after we missed totally in the United States, the vaccine was done in time to prevent the disease in Europe. And exactly 0 shots were administered in Europe. Why? Even though we produced all these dosages that we never gave to anyone in the United States. Why? Because The world lacks a regulatory mechanism for the vaccine to be approved in Europe quickly. It lacks a liability mechanism to resolve the question of if you gave someone that shot and they got sick, who could they sue? How much could they get, right? And no one could agree on any of these things. As a result, no one were given these shots in Europe at that time. And so you can imagine something breaks out right now, and you know, the liability issues, the legal issues, the regulatory issues are profound. And we're going to be deciding this on the fly in the middle of some crisis.
Yeah. I wanted to hone in on this U.S. leadership piece for the current Ebola outbreak, and I don't disagree with anything that you said, but clearly you can't take the approach in West Africa, where the massive U.S. response, 3,000 troops, and translate that in the Congo situation for the very reason that you said. This is a totally different environment, not exactly welcoming to outside intervention. So the concrete things that, if there were leadership from the U.S. perspective, what would be the sort of specific things that you would see the U.S. would be doing? Would it be just more money to those people who are responding?
So it'd be a lot of things. I think let's start with the fact that, in fact, what we have done, good news, bad news. I do think the U.S., and particularly under the leadership more of Secretary Azar than anyone else, has been on the scene. We have written some checks. We have made some financial contributions. We have, though, actually pulled our people out of the response zone. We had CDC epidemiologists and experts on the front lines, and in a decision that basically, there's no other way for me to describe it other than a decision that we weren't going to risk one American life to save thousands of lives in Africa, we pulled all those people out of the response zone and told them they had to stay away from the disease. Now, in some future world, there should be local responders as well trained, as expert, as well equipped as CDC people, but that future world is not today. And their absence from the front lines is a critical absence, and that's just a policy choice that was made at the White House, okay? So I would have made the opposite policy choice. In fact, I would have sent more people in there. Now, again, that's a horrible choice in some ways, because those people are definitely exposed to risk. Those people were definitely exposed to danger. But what I can tell you from knowing those people, from my work with them, they want to be there. You know, that some of you in this room will go on to do something like that and be generous and self-sacrificing and courageous. And we are holding those people back right now in Congo from doing what they want to do. And so that's the second thing. The third thing I want to say about this is, what I think we really would be doing if President Obama was there is engaged in very active diplomacy with Congo's neighbors to create a local security force. We used in 2014, we used the African Union to play a significant role in sending in responders and some security support and some logistical support that kind of, first of all, took the burden off of us and also made the response more local and more integrated. And I think that active diplomacy could do the same thing now. I don't mean to minimize the difficulty of what's going on there, and I'm not saying any of these things are like, and it's done, but I think basically we are doing the minimum possible, not the maximum possible. And I think the biggest difference is the level of engagement in diplomacy, in working with other countries in Africa to step up. I absolutely agree. I would not send the 101st Airborne into Congo the way we did in Liberia. They would have to like literally fight their way in. That would be a horrible, horrible thing. But I do think there are a lot of other solutions between that and pulling our people out that I think could be much more effective.
Can I ask, what would you, so I don't disagree. I want to know what your advice would have been for the security of the U.S. government folks that you would have encouraged to go.
So again, I think I would have really tried to work with the neighboring nations on putting together some kind of multilateral force to help secure our people. You also could have used private contractors a little less desirably, and you could have been engaged in a lot more active diplomacy inside Congo itself to try to negotiate safe passage for people, to try to work on this. And then you could, look, there's one of the things the administration should do tomorrow, which it has not done, which is, as in all these situations, community trust and engagement is the critical piece. It's missing. One thing that our responders on the ground there very much want to do is to stand up healthcare clinics to deliver basic healthcare services, to build community trust, to build community engagement, start to treat other diseases, start to get people in there. The money exists to do that. The money's been appropriated to do that. It is blocked right now because of a U.S. statute, an understandable statute that has sanctions against Congo for the presence of human trafficking in this part of Congo. And so as a result, we've got money that could go build these clinics. We've got people who could go build these clinics, and it's frozen behind this wall that says you can't send money in there for non-emergency purposes because there's human trafficking going on. The administration could waive that with the sign of a pen, and that money could go there, and our responders could do what they need to do. And that, again, that's a policy choice, and I think it's a policy choice that I would make tomorrow morning.
Could we call the measles outbreak an emergency?
We could call the measles outbreak an emergency. We could just say there isn't an emergency. We could do a lot of things, but what's pretty clear is that right now, at least, the administration's been unwilling to release those funds to do that kind of community engagement, which, look, in an area as unstable, and racked with violence and distrust as this is, building some kind of more sustainable relationship with the community is very, very important, and we're just not doing that.
So to follow up on the measles outbreak, for those who don't know this, measles outbreak right now in DRC as well, and it's actually killed more each patient than the Ebola has in the last 10 months. So without calling it an emergency, how can the responders and the healthcare system in general respond to the Ebola outbreak or any other Ebola outbreak going forwards without dropping the ball on things that are also have a high case fatality rate, and also because distrust in the community, because you see the responders going after Ebola and then they see their kids dying of measles, and it creates distrust. It's like, well, they're interested in this flashy Ebola outbreak that not everyone sees, but everyone sees the measles outbreak.
And the malaria.
And malaria, yeah. It is a tricky thing, and I think it involves politics there and politics here. Mm-hmm. And as I said before, this is, I think, the challenge of the field many of you are choosing to go into. We like to think it's all about science and expertise and health, but public health exists with the public, and the public are like a big giant political beast. And so you can't take kind of politics and human behavior and out of that. And so let's start with this side of this. You can't go to Congress, sadly, and tell people, I need money to fight measles in Africa, okay? Because their perspective is basically like, measles, like we have shots for that in America, and if people would take the shots, we'd be fine, so I'm not really worried about that, But you can tell them, I need money to go fight Ebola in Africa, because Ebola, it's like scary, and until recently we didn't really have any way to treat it, and like what if it came here and we'd all die, and I've seen the movie, and so on and so forth, right? That's politics, right? And we used to have these debates inside my office as we were winding down the Ebola response about what our global health security agenda should be like, right? And we'd have these conversations. We were on the verge of getting $1 billion for Congress. As a result of the Ebola thing, $1 billion for Congress, an unprecedented investment in global health security. And you'd have these country meetings, and you'd say, what's your biggest health problem? And it'd be like people falling off their motor scooters and cracking their heads open. And what we want to do is like run billboards that say, wear a helmet. And I was like, look, I can't get Congress to appropriate money to like run billboards in your country that say, wear your helmet. Like, it's just not what we're going to fund here in America, okay? Now, let's fund the things that we can get funded. And I think we have to, be in a kind of an iterative process here on our side of this, of explaining to people in Congress and policymakers in the executive branch and all over why treating some of these fundamental health threats isn't just a humanitarian project, but is in our interest. Why checking the spread of measles in Africa really is something we should worry about. Malaria is something we should be worried about. Why it makes a difference. This point about community engagement I was making before, how it's critical to these things we want to do, so on and so forth. And we need to do better on that. On the other hand, we also need to recognize that in the imperfect world, in the political world which we live in, our country is going to be much more responsive to these threats that they fear coming here than we are to these threats that we feel are part of each country's own national health responsibility and response. And so I think that's it. I think over there, we have to take whatever resources we have and try to do better on some of these issues around building support and trust in the community and engagement in the community. And we also just have to be more culturally aware as we go around the world and do these things. One of the most challenging issues we faced in West Africa in 2014 was the question of burials. Ebola is most infectious, most contagious when someone dies and their body sheds the virus, and merely touching people who are dead is a massive way the disease spreads. It was particularly spreading that way in West Africa because there's a burial ritual there that all someone's relatives comes up and touches the body and cleans the body and rubs the body. And so literally it was a cultural practice that was just designed to spread this disease rapidly. And we failed badly in understanding that and responding to that on our first few efforts. We even, bought body bags that were the wrong color, that were culturally offensive and insensitive, and didn't really understand how to do this and how to persuade people to change that practice or abstain from that practice. Ultimately, we developed a policy of working with local religious leaders. It was a tricky policy because the area is predominantly Muslim, and a lot of the local religious leaders are very hostile to the United States. And so working with them was a very controversial policy inside our government. But we had to do it. We did do it. And it made a big difference in kind of changing attitudes. But there's no getting away from the fact that part of public health is about engaging the public where it is, and religious beliefs and religious practices are part of that. And and last thing I'll say about this, is while we were fighting this battle inside the government and on Capitol Hill about how to deal with these issues, people would say to me, "Well, look, I don't understand this. Why can't you just tell these people that this is how the disease is spreading, and why won't they just listen? And aren't these people backwards or whatever, blah, 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 blah." And while we're having this conversation, right, literally one day I was up on the Hill having this conversation. That day, they had to shut down Disneyland because 60 people had gotten measles there because people in Orange County, California had the bizarre cultural belief that you don't need to vaccinate your children, okay? So this question about public attitudes and cultural beliefs is not just something that exists in other countries, in other cultures. It exists here now in our country, in our culture, and it's part of the ongoing struggle of the work you all are taking on.
I would love to go back in the political lens and hear your thoughts about the role the U.S. could play in engaging with multilaterals. We talked about WHO, but there's this other really interesting thing sitting out there that I think a lot of people would argue has failed in the DRC, and that's the pandemic financing program of the World Bank.
Yeah.
And would you have any recommendations sort of on the role the U.S. could play in engaging with that multilateral, influencing that multilateral to either redesign or have different triggers so that the U.S. isn't alone moving forward, obviously the technical lead, but that other resources, so we don't spend all of our time on the Hill and getting that money released, but we can kind of have access to funding flows separate from the political process.
Well, it's a great point. And my friend Lori Garrett has been the most articulate and outspoken critic of the World Bank's financing mechanism, and justifiably so. And she knows a lot more about this than I do. And my basic view is whatever she says, I agree with. But look, I mean, I think President Kim, when he set up this mechanism, I think it was perfectly well intentioned. I think it was the best of intentions, and we were going to never have something like we had with West Africa again. The money would always be there, so on and so forth. And the amazing thing about this is it literally has not worked once in the 5 years since then. So it's I don't. So yes, this is a well-intentioned but completely failed initiative. And yes, I do think with new leadership at these global financial institutions, it's important for the U.S. to engage and try to get that that financing vehicle restructured and used in a way that it can actually be used and could be used in something like what's going on in Congo is a classic example of the idea that the WHO is running around with like a little tin cup and banging on doors and trying to literally shake what is the equivalent of pennies loose from rich nations is crazy. When there's, on the other hand, there's literally billions of dollars sitting behind a fence that no one can understand what is like the magic Harry Potter spell that's supposed to, turn it loose. And so that definitely,
Dead.
pardon me?
20 people outside of the DRC dead.
Yeah. And, and so I think that definitely, there's no question that needs to be changed. And I think, look, let's talk about one other multilateral organization, which is the United Nations. So the United Nations was just an unmitigated disaster in 2014, 2015. They created a response organization called UNMIR that was the most poorly organized and dysfunctional thing I've ever seen, literally made zero difference, and was hugely ineffective. And so I think, we need to figure out some multilateral organization that can help organize and mobilize these responses. It's kind of increasingly falling on WHO. That's just not their thing. I mean, it just isn't. And I think, and that's not to be a criticism, particularly not of Dr. Tedros, who I do think is doing a better job than his predecessor, but it's just not their thing. They are a regulatory organization. They obviously have great stature, but they are never going to be the people who can pick up a phone and send 5,000 people someplace and really and manage something like that. And it's not the UN, at least it hasn't been the UN. So there's a big gap here, and we are just waiting for that gap to bite us all in the behind. Last thing, I want to go back to on this cultural point, and I just mentioned this before, but I want to reemphasize that, particularly with this group. The intersection of the foreign language challenge and epidemic response is one of the least appreciated problems, okay? In 2014, 2015, again, we were unbelievably lucky that 80% of the disease took place in places where people spoke English, okay? That is not what the world looks like, to say the least. We had a crisis getting people to fill the positions we needed in Guinea because we couldn't find enough French-speaking people to go and fill the response in Guinea. Okay, that's French. When one of these things happens and the language is Urdu or who knows what, so we have to find a better way to make public health and global security a multilingual discipline. We have to find a way to train more people in other countries who speak these languages, because the idea that basically a bunch of us English speakers are going to go traipsing around the world and solve these problems is not what this problem looks like, in the next 50 years. And as I said, if you're impaired finding French speakers, that to me was like the flashing red light that it's going to be hard, some of these other things. And by the way, I speak only English, so I'm the last person to criticize. It's like when I went to Georgetown, we had a foreign language requirement. But back then, you could satisfy the foreign language requirement by taking 1 semester of computer programming. And so I graduated here in 1983, which is like 1,000 years ago. And so not only did I not take foreign language, but the computer programming language I took in 1982, I don't think has been used in a computer since 1985. So I neither speak foreign language nor computer language at this stage in the game.
Can I just ask one last question?
Sure, of course.
And hope I'm not opening a whole new can of worms
With 3 minutes left to go, yeah. Okay. Well, that's on me to fix.
So you've talked a little bit about WHO and UN and multi-nats, and one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about is global governance and kind of the systems that exist for global governance of disease. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on what's happening in Tanzania as a commentary on the effectiveness of global governance.
Well, it's a great question, Rebecca, and we're going to find out. Like, I mean, it's like we are going to find out. And so, for those of you who don't know, right, there appears to have been, perhaps as an offshoot of this outbreak in Congo, perhaps separate outbreak, don't know. Perhaps there have been some cases. Perhaps there's one case. Perhaps there's more than one case of Ebola in Tanzania. The WHO has been trying to get samples and verify this. The government has refused to allow that. The WHO last Friday sent, I think, kind of an unprecedented public communication that was basically like, you know, this is happening, you need to let us in there. And Tanzania responded by like trying to arrest everyone who works for the WHO. So I'd say, as if we sit here today, it's not going well. But look, this is a fundamental test of the WHO. I said that lumping the response function on them is asking them to do something that they do not do well. This is something that's supposed to be their core competency. That is, they are supposed to escalate this, and they are supposed to perhaps declare Tanzania in violation of the international health regulations, then maybe announce travel restrictions to Tanzania or travel warnings for Tanzania. 90,000 Americans a year go to Tanzania for tourism, 130,000 people from North America. And if the WHO did something that endangered that by like saying it's unsafe to travel there, then my guess is that the Tanzanian government would respond to it. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't, who knows. But I think, you know, this is a critical moment to see what comes next. And if the WHO basically backs off and basically says, I sent a nasty letter and I'm done, and like, you know, we'll just see what happens, that will be a very, very, very bad thing. I mean, you have to have some ability to, I mean, if you're going to kind of say, well, we do this response stuff, but that's not really our thing. What we really do is we write and enforce the international health regulations, then you have to enforce the international health regulations. And enforcement means you have to have, you know, nice meetings and conferences, but sometimes toughness. And this is really, this is it. This is the case, and we're going to learn. I mean, it already makes me a little sad that 6 days have passed and nothing's happened. But you know, like I think by next week they have to do something and they have to escalate. I hope there's no evidence of this, that they're in some kind of quiet diplomatic behind-the-scenes dialogue to solve this. But I fear they're sitting in Geneva, kind of going, and that's bad. So I think it's a great question because it's a great moment, and I think what happens here in the next week is something that people in this field will be studying for a long time, because I think this really is the classic case and the flashpoint case, and we're going to see what happens.
It also sets a precedent, right?
Sets a huge precedent, one way or the other, right? If you can stiff the WHO when you're talking about something like Ebola, when you're talking about something like this, then really the WHO goes from being an international regulatory organization to like an international public relations organization or something like that. And their credibility and the credibility of the IHR is really on the line right now, and they have to follow through.
Because they never did with Saudi.
They never did with Saudi, and you know, but look, fairly or unfairly, what I'd say is it's also on the line because Secretary Azar has gone out there and put himself on the line. And I think if WHO doesn't follow through, that's going to be a huge confidence breaker with our government. And it's going to have a huge pall over our already inadequate, unsatisfactory engagement on this. And then you run the risk that sooner or later, and probably more sooner than later, that we act unilaterally. And we put out some travel advisory about going to Tanzania. And then, like, once we act unilaterally outside the WHO structure, then every time someone coughs in some country, we're going to be like putting out travel advisories. And you know, it's just going to be a really, really bad scenario. And so you can like it or not like it, but like either the WHO acts or kind of Katie bar the door.
On that fun note.
On that fun note.
Before I'll thank Ron for giving up your time this morning and talking to us. I want to just mention, really thankful for everyone for coming today. And we are currently scheduled, what are the dates? The next one of these seminars will be back in this room, October 25th. Carol Griffin of who is an affiliate with the center and the original founder of the Elizabeth R. Griffin Foundation, will be here to speak in honor of Biosecurity, Biosafety Month. And that'll be the 25th, and then Paul Reed will be here on November 15th. I'm hoping to talk about some issues related to health security on the border. But if he's not allowed to talk about that, he'll be talking about a war game that the DoD just held about responding to an outbreak in an urban environment overseas. So it should be exciting. With that, though, please join me in thanking Ron for his time.